All right. David, how are you? How was your weekend?
Very good, very good. It's so good to see you, Jamin.
Yeah, yeah,
Good weekend. We're,
likewise.
we're wrapping up the quarter here at UCLA, so it's been a bit hectic. Makes me all the more excited to have a good conversation.
Yeah, no, it's fun. I appreciate you joining me. We've changed the format for I changed the format for the podcast. In the past I've been like interviewing people individually, and then I got some guidance that it was good to have something that was like weekly, repeatable, and we already have the newsletter every week, so it made sense to try and do that. Yeah, Danny, maybe I guess for people who don't know you, do you want to give like a brief introduction to who you are and yeah, what you do, maybe why and why I asked you to join me.
Sure, I'd love to. My name is Danny Snelson, associate professor at UCLA in English and Design Media Arts, where I also work with the UCLA Game Lab, the Digital Humanities Program, and the Laboratory for Environmental Narrative Strategies.
All
My
right.
work broadly is just on video games. I'm working on a book called Eerie Wonder about the apprehension of networks in video game aesthetics and the prosody of discovery. I think that's me in a nutshell.
Okay. All right. Cool. Well, one of the things I was hoping to do was kind of go through, I write this newsletter every single week. And one of the things I was looking to do was to try to cover some of the items in the newsletter. I mean, I think to start, I spent the last weekend, this past weekend, I went to New York City. When's the last, have you been to New York recently? Have you been to, I don't know if you've spent any time in New York in the last like year or so.
Yeah, I'm back and forth, usually at least every year.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it's like the like Mamdani like afterglow or it's just like the
Nick's
it
descendant.
was yeah, exactly. Yeah, the Knicks. It was crazy. I was with a friend who was wearing like Knicks gear, and he was just like high-fiving people on the street. Like there's just like a camaraderie, and this is before the first game had started, and people were just so excited. You don't really get that as much in Los Angeles. Even we have like successful sports teams here. There's not. It's almost like it's because we've been spoiled by like success at some level in sports over the last 5 to 10 years. I feel like people kind of there's no droughts. Need like a drought to kind of drought basically to help spur camaraderie.
Yeah,
But
it's been interesting, like watching the I don't know, the various responses to the World Cup and some of the like ridiculous failings already on the United States' behalf, alongside the success, the return of the NBA as a kind of like
yeah,
focal point.
yeah, yeah,
There must
yeah,
be some
yeah.
kind of there must be something about the way that the cities are hosting and thinking about those different kinds of sports dynamics.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I went to Demo Fest this weekend. Demo is part of New Inc. New Inc. is a arts and tech incubator. It was started about 10, 12 years ago. I knew the first director, Julia Kagansky, who was there, and our first office actually used to be like behind the new museum, so we get this like reflected light from the exterior. But they've done a lot over the last decade, really, to try to advance the professional careers of a lot of artists that are making stuff with technology. And this past year, it was super interesting because they actually had a whole significantly more work that was like focused on games, including quite a few talks that were curated by Rhizome, a panel with Theo Trentafilides, who's a DMA, UCLA, digital media arts
Yeah.
graduate, as well as some other stuff that was out like in the exhibition. They had a little mini exhibition that kind of like moved that helped kind of like frame some of the things that were happening. I really got me thinking about the my experiences going to museums over the last 10 or so, or longer than that, but certainly looking at games in museum context over the last 15 years. And it really is this thing where it's like the shape of the future is here. You just kind of need to know like where ultimately like where to look. Can you tell me maybe a little bit one of the things that came up at the conference, there was a great talk by Mitchell Chan, who's an artist based out of Toronto, was a playlist selectee for us recently at Killscreen. And he gave this great talk kind of like looking at games, artists who are making games and attempting to present a definition. Because he was joking that when something is sufficiently gotten large in size, is sufficiently successful. Of course, the thing that we need to do is define subcategories. That's like the most important thing. Is to like make sure that we've got the dashes in place, the little micro genres. We really got to figure it out. But I felt like it was a real challenge in terms of like, because we are in this place that it does seem kind of unique. There are more artists making games. How have you thought about maybe some of the like the subcategory stuff in terms of thinking about like, well, how do these games sort of fit in? Because it's gotten so much bigger than just like indie games, like as a category.
Yeah, I'm so interested in the way you wrote about that historical change, or this question of the real predominance. I mean, the same. You covered this well in the letter, but also I think in LA, I mean, it's rare to see a show that has anything to do with technology that's not saturated with game forms or references to game forms, and then the game forms also bleed into like other media, like sculpture and painting, in ways that I find really fascinating. As far as like breaking those things into like subgenres, it's so like it's almost like bewildering that maybe in like 2008 you could like have like a documentary that is on indie games as a whole, or that there's like 2 academic monographs on like art and games, and they tried to be kind of comprehensive, like here's the history, here's all of it, and I think that's impossible now. There's just far too much, and it sprawls in so many different directions.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things I did appreciate about the talk is that, I had a background I had a background writing about music before I wrote for Pitchfork many, many moons ago. And obviously having genre distinctions was such a huge piece of like what I think about that like period of like internet writing, like about music, was like breaking out these little subsections, because you had SoundCloud, you had digital distribution that encouraged people to sort of figure out, and it's sort of pre-algorithmic, so it's kind of before Spotify, and it's all happening kind of organically. Artists obviously like hate all this. What I thought was interesting, one is like I have found in the past that artists like hate categorization, whereas like I feel like game makers are maybe a bit more comfortable with this sort of thinking about their game in terms of genre. And then also, for Mitchell, one of the things that he was trying to outline was advancing idea of like agential art, as opposed to when you're thinking about genre, as opposed to like a mechanic descriptor, right? So this is a role-playing game, or this is a first-person shooter, trying to use some categories that were more reflective of the core experience of the work, as opposed to nailing it down. Because a lot of artists are making games with like a wide variety of mechanics, but they now kind of like fit under some sort of umbrella. So I thought that was super interesting, that maybe the kind of the next development is maybe more focused on some other experiential factors, or something that's a little bit more opaque, as opposed to like what you do in a video game. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think with the the ubiquity of games, I mean, it's part of what drew me to games. So my background is in experimental art and literature, and I'm like reverse engineering, thinking about rule-based, constraint-based literature as always being actually more involved with games, or offering things to video game studies than one might have thought 20 years ago, before the ubiquity of games. But I came into games because you really reinvent the field every time. Like the book is relatively stable, and we have like stable genres in literary studies. There can be like hybrid forms, but the novel, the romance novel,
Right.
and then, like genre fiction is like, how do you shelve a thing? Like this goes in sci-fi,
Right.
goes in fantasy, but they're often kind of like more mixed than one might think. And like games, they keep having to invent new, like, I don't know, like Metroidvania, for example. It can be like an entire category, or like the varieties of like weird deck builders that have come out that also like do these hybrid forms that pick different mechanics. And I think resisting definition by mechanic is actually a really useful way to think about games. And it's inverse, like focusing, like there are games that maybe the mechanic is the game, versus like games that have like wild hybrid mechanics across the board. So I don't know, I think that categorization is useful to know, like to build like genre communities as well. I feel like, the more works that you have in a specific genre, those works can speak to each other. So you can make like an anti FPS, for example, and only because there are already a dominant set of first-person shooter games. And so like having dominant genres in, say, AAA gaming or mainstream gaming enables artists to take those genres and then flip them on their heads, or do kind of like counter generic work.
Yeah. I mean, it is very difficult, I find, for artists making games, in part because you're sort of pulled between these two different, like if you're a game maker that's just making games, it's so much more straightforward, right? Like your community is other game makers, your distribution mechanisms are all focused on games. But for artists coming to the field from something different, they're often having to interface with these two different environments. Like one is a game making community, a game making audience has certain ideas and expectations. And then you have like an art making audience, right? And so that is I think there is some complexity. There is some complexity there. I think specifically for artists who are making games that can be a little bit hard to resolve. That you often find yourself sort of speaking between like different worlds. And so maybe some of the categorization is a way to it feels like maybe a way to kind of like widen the net so the artists don't, to your point about community, they don't feel like they're so alone. So if you're an artist making games, you're like, oh, my community is actually this little pocket of independent game makers, or this little pocket, maybe it's scene based on your location or something like that. But yeah, it is really driven by, I think to your point, yeah, it's really driven by a sense of a desire to be with others when you're making games, which can be a pretty lonely pursuit.
Well, and genres also, genres produce reading expectations.
Mm-hmm.
So like the genre kind of primes you. Like if you place a game within a certain context, you read it and you think of it differently. I think a lot about Young Chu's amazing "Do Metaphors Dream of Literal Sleep,"
Okay.
where she works with science fiction in particular, and thinking about how if you read the sentence, "His head exploded." If it's a science fiction book, it reads quite differently than if it's like I don't know, like a realistic teen comedy, right? Like, is it a metaphor? Is it like a high intensity form of like reality? And I think that games do that same thing when they set up different kind of generic expectations for their players. We run into this all the time at the UCLA Game Lab, where our students are kind of hovering between gallery practices and game making practices. And so, our students will make like a game and it's like, should this live in a gallery? Does this live in Twitch? Like, where do you place it? And where you place it produces different expectations and different forms of engagement. So I think all those questions are really also like, I think, exploding right now, given how much production is happening at this intersection, this kind of experimental intersection of art and game making.
Got it. Yeah, it got me thinking maybe there should be a visual novel, some kind of like visual novel romance game that does involve heads exploding. So with a sufficient amount of romantic overtures may trigger a scanners esque sequence. Well, let's look at a couple of the games. I got a couple of the trailers here for some of the things I saw when I was in New York that got me thinking about it. The first comes from Peter Nichols. This is a game called Crude Oil. A game called Crude Oil. Peter's actually, I actually was in a class I taught for New Ink on games. Was on games. The context is really interesting because he's playing with these two different ideas. One is kind of like a physics-based game where you play as this sort of like gelatinous blob. But the background is obviously the sort of the sinister nature of crude oil, right? So it might sort of give the appearance of being this, sort of like cute object, but is the thing that is ultimately responsible for, this sort of like climate collapse. I liked the inversion. This is like a good example where like Peter is a game maker and an artist, but he's also like inverting some of the tropes that you might see with like wholesome cozy games. Which I think speaks to your point about this idea that artists often can play with like some of these. Artists can like often play with some of these ideas and kind of invert those two things. Do you think of another, I don't know, kind of cozy inversion example, either like in the arts or sort of playing with softness, but like doing it in a very kind of like, I guess it's kind of like a Soylent Green, sort of like a sinister sort of way.
Yeah, I love this. I love this crude little blob. It's so adorable, but also like there's something so funny about like having this, crude, like I guess you would call it an anti-hero, maybe. But I think that the defining game, I guess, in that genre is Doki Doki Literature Club.
Right. Okay.
Or that whole genre, and I think horror games do this maybe more than anything else. Where Me-Side is maybe a more recent example, where it seems like you're playing a kind of cozy sim or a dating game, and then that mode of play like can like set up a kind of like calm that is interrupted by absolute horror or things going terribly awry or glitching out. So I don't know. I think it's like it's one like really like direct way, and I think that that's part of like the power of genres is like, and horror does this all the time, where it's like if you set up like I had a project once about horror movies where I wanted to just like produce cuts of horror movies where the credits rolled like right before the first minor note. So like it would be like something like like hard on their luck families find a great house for a perfect price, and then like everything just ends happily. But like horror's always like it gives you like a minor note and it like sets up this kind of like, oh, everything's going to be better, and then it's able to like parse through like there's actually like horror lurking inside, but you have to set up that like coziness or that sort of like sense of like romance or calm so that you can break it, and that's kind of like where those like moments of horror come from.
Right. The average everyday experience, and then something is just drifts a little bit, and then things maybe drift from there. It is always like a slight drift, right? So it's never like a explicit from the gate. Like usually it's like you sort of have something. I do think as a marker, I think of like more contemporary horror, which we'll talk about a little bit later. I think with Backrooms and things like that. But yeah. One of the other great experiences I had was going to see Leo Castañeda's work. There you go. Leo Castañeda is a Miami-based artist. His grandmother was a Colombian painter who spent her formative years in the Amazonian rain basin, and he has spent, gosh, man, he's been working on this game for so long. I saw it as an MFA project that he was working on in 2011. But it's a game. It's called Camouflux Levels and Bosses, and you sort of play as this sort of figure who's kind of operating inside of this like non-narrative space. One of the defining features, I think, for Leo is texture, and he's done a lot of great work of taking his own paintings. He's an abstract expressionist painter informed by Latin American abstraction, and scanning them and then turning those into maps and textures like inside of like the game itself. Also very heavily influenced by Kojima and Metal Gear Solid. He's trying to also invert stealth. That was one of the things he talked about at the conference with Demo Fest, is inverting this like context for stealth, where stealth is not something like a kill or be killed, but is much more something about like blending in with environments and finding like harmony with environments, as opposed to trying to basically like save your own skin, so to speak. But one of the things I thought was tremendously cool was the fact that he was selected for the Whitney Biennale as one of the artists selected as part of their show. He got basically a big huge corner. I mean, I would say relative to some of the other artists in the show, I mean, I'd say a pretty remarkable stage with a background vinyl. I was curious, had you seen Leo's work before, or I'm just curious if you had seen Leo's work before, just any thoughts that you had on seeing it here.
It's so stunning. No, and like so many things, Jamin, I'm so grateful for your investigative reporting and your work in the field to bring these treasures to my laptop. I love, I mean, I think that there's something so fantastic about bridging the kind of like analog painting practice with texture creation in virtual environments. I think there's something like really poignant about, fighting against both generative assets, which of course is like a big discourse, but
Right.
also
Yeah,
like,
sure.
like Unreal Engine fatigue, where you have these like high res things, but all the textures are the same. It's like you see the same tree in like 5 different games. And I think that there's such a hunger for that the like, there's something about like the analog that still feels to us like quite human, and those moments when the analog gets converted to the digital, it feels like more real than real in some ways. I got this experience quite a bit playing maybe like Expedition 33 or something.
Okay.
Where you have these like, fantastical painted landscapes, and that being immersed in them made me feel closer to painting than I might feel to an actual painting in a gallery. Like there's like something about that like proprioceptive, like living inside a painting that I think is really like awe-inspiring here.
Yeah. I mean, we use that phrase like, work is like painterly, a game is like painterly, but I think that often describes, I think that's like language that sort of gets used, it's just sort of shorthand for like, beautiful, as opposed to like the actual like texture of paint, like the actual, like you can sort of feel like Leo's background, like as a painter, like really coming through. And yeah, it's such a good point about the process side of it. I think we see a lot of Unreal stuff that ends up, Unreal Unity that ends up having the same sort of like look and feel. And it's a nice reminder that, so I think sometimes as players, we can be bound to think that the way that things are the way that things have to be. And it's a nice reminder that if you're coming from a different practice, you may bring a different set of skills, a different set of concerns for the visual language. I think that's a lot. I mean, I think that is also something that, for an art realm audience, they are also going to respond to. One of the other things I thought was interesting about Camoflux Recall Grotto was that there were 2 different modes. The one you can see here on screen, you could sit and play through a short vertical slice with a sculpture that he had designed, like an acrylic sculpture that you could sit on, the best gaming furniture, best gaming furniture that money could buy. But there was also a vertical, basically machinima video clip that he had designed. It's sort of like you could sort of zoom and zoom out of this kind of like sequence and loop. And that to me felt like also one of these like accommodations for putting work in gallery spaces where for people who have controller anxiety, they still can experience the work in a meaningful way without having to like pick up a controller. But I thought Leo working with the curatorial team, the decision to do that, I thought was a really good curatorial choice. There was one other piece. This was by accident at DB. Let me see if I can find it. There was one other piece that was not explicit. Here it is, right here. So there's some work by Isabel Frances McGuire, who is a sculptor. She focuses mostly on American myth, and so she had a sequence there. A sequence of sculptures there. Hold this up. This is from ArtNet. But a sequence of sculptures that at first glance, so these are all, there's two sides to this wall. On the one side, you have these like hooded figures. But all the character models were all pulled from Doom. Like it's in the exhibition text. It's like got me thinking about like, how Isabel came to Doom as a place to pull individual figures. And also what that might say about what she's trying to suggest about the work, about like the nature of like violence in American history. But this work is focused on the two different sides of the Salem witch trial, which I thought was super interesting. These hooded figures that sort of bear resemblance of maybe sort of like video game characters, but like not quite in a way that's like legible.
Yeah, I love that bleed. I think that's so, and I think that's one of the things where you can take the meaning making system of a game and then port it into like some other kind of sculptural practice. I mean, we and culture at large, right? So we keep saying like, I mean, are these NPCs, for example, and
right?
Like what is the baggage that an NPC holds when you put it in context with like a sculptural practice or like the history of the Salem witch trials. There's all kinds of ways I think that opens up this kind of like dual portal where and this is one of the things I worked on in my first book, The Little Database, which is like when you digitize, like the movement between analog and digital practices like has this mutually illuminating effect where like there's an obvious thing to say like, oh, okay, you have to understand these sculptures through Doom. But I think like the more provocative thing is how does a sculpture like this transform our understanding of Doom? Like if this is like part of like this like ever growing kind of canon of fandoms or whatever that are reworking those materials, I feel like next time I do open up Doom, I'm gonna like hallucinate some like Salem witchcraft thoughts, which I think is like a nice experience of like living cultural property and the like like ongoing kind of shuffling of references.
Yeah. This character on the right is the one that really jumped out at me. I was like, this looks so familiar. It's one of these things like it is familiar if you have played games, but it does not explicitly like position itself as being like a game based work, which I thought was like pretty remarkable. Cool. I mean, there were a couple other things that kind of jumped top of mind for me as I was thinking about these. As I was sort of thinking about my experience in New York, it came up in the newsletter and some other ways. I didn't get a chance to make it sound like there was an opportunity available to me to go to the Venice Biennale this year. The big, obviously, big arts festival that happens every year in the city that bears its name. But there were a couple game-based things that showed up there that I thought were super interesting. The first was, I guess, another DMA grad, Adrian Abella's Declaration of Dependence, which is let me see if I can find it here. Okay. Declaration of Dependence, it's actually on a different website. It started as a 2023 work, but was selected for the Maltese pavilion. And they worked with False Work, which is a lot of crossover with DMA, a lot of crossover with UCLA's DMA department. But it was like an engine based work where there's three functional zones, and a character that represents basically the spirit of Malta that you could interact with. I believe it's AI powered, so it's powered by this like conversational. You have a conversation with this individual character over time. You can see it down here on the right hand side. So that was one that I thought was like a super interesting integration of like game engine based work. I think Abella doesn't have like that in his locker, so to speak. It's a work with an external partner. And then the other one was significantly stranger. So I heard about this from a friend of mine about the Chinese pavilion. Here, let me show this to you. I'd love to get your thoughts on this.
Yeah.
So in the Chinese pavilion at the Venice Biennale is that they just had like a non-playable version of Black Myth Wukong. Wukong. I'd love to get your take on this. I was a little confused by it in the sense that there are other great Chinese artists working with games.
Yeah.
I was a little confused by how this ended up there. What do you make of something like this kind of like showing up kind of like without context, like in a place like the Biennale?
Oh my God, Jamin, I feel like I could talk about this for an hour. There's so much going on here. And, of course, yeah, I think the last time I was at Venice for the Biennale, Liu Yang had like a major,
Right.
major works. And so like, yeah, like this is like there's a lot of artists, but I think what you compared the Poland giving Obama The Witcher,
Yeah.
like this kind of like national cultural export. And of course, like this like invokes that whole history with like the release patterns of Wukong and sort of like the bans on certain kinds of criticism. That like it seemed like the game itself as it circulated had always had, maybe propaganda is too strong a word, but like a strong kind of like a strong set of expectations of how the world would receive such a game, and it makes sense. I mean, Journey to the West, which the game is a kind of retelling of, is sort of like a national treasure
Right.
of a narrative, and it shows up in so many works. I'm reading through Omniscient Reader's Viewpoint right now, where it has like a very prominent role, and so I think that there's like both this kind of like deep history of like national identity around like the great epic or something. Like I don't know what we have in the States that's similar, maybe like Passion of the Christ. But like, and at the same time, this kind of like, yeah, like identifying it as an artwork in the Biennale is such a like, it's a weird move. It's a weird move on so many different levels. And I think also it's like that, like it feels like in so many ways we're talking about like artists making games and how artists navigate being in art or game contexts. There's something really puzzling about a pavilion representing a nation taking something that's clearly a game, like a AAA video game, and then like the other ones are like also art. This is an art work that exists. And yeah, I like I said, I think there would be far more time to parse this than we might have in our conversation.
Yeah. I mean, I do think some of it is these, all of these types of events are a stage for like cultural diplomacy. Like that is the subtext for them. The fact that you're divided up by countries, right? And the idea is to bring the world's artists they represent in the countries where you have to be. We have seen the United States had huge issues with our pavilion this year and who gets to represent who. And so these are obviously like by definition, like political questions. At the same time, it does sort of, to me, reflect that there's like a, what is the word? Like there is a, like it's like there's a concern on the part of the Chinese pavilion that they need to showcase those things out in the world. Like Black Myth, like the demonstration of Black Myth's success as a cultural product is that it's sold like tens of millions of units, and so like I think that turn to say like, oh, this also needs to be taken seriously in an artistic, like in a different context entirely, I thought was an interesting juxtaposition with what I'd seen like at the Whitney, which was like selecting a game, presenting it in the context of these other artists, but selecting a game that sort of like fits or is in discourse with a theme for the show. Whereas this one just kind of felt like just kind of popped in. But I'm very curious what people working their way, and because it was non-playable, again, does it make any of those kind of like concessions to a gallery context where, they had designed a version of it that would be playable for audiences, and games are by definition interactive. And so the whole thing felt extremely, extremely strange.
Yeah. And then it's just like an image, like you called it like an ad, but it's like this like kind of like index, or it's just this icon that's like this game is not here, but it exists, and it's like the whole thing is the work. Like in some ways, if it were edited down to like a machinima or a video, and of course like the game is undeniably beautiful, and I think as a culture we're still trying to figure out like how do we make sense of these multimedia objects that we call games.
Right.
There's a tremendous amount of artistry in the game, but I think that there's something weird about like just indexing the like it's not like usually when you go to a pavilion like you see the art, like the art is there, and this is just an index for an art that lives somewhere else.
Yeah. Damn.
There, yeah.
A question for you, Danny, is like who's getting the better end of the arrangement? Is the art world or the video game world getting the better end of the arrangement when something like this like happens at a pavilion?
I have a few different responses to that. My better end of the bargain, like you could think of that in sort of economic terms.
Right. Sure.
Of course,
sure.
like
Arrangement. Let's say arrangement might be a better, more value neutral.
Yeah, well,
more
like,
value neutral.
When you call something like an art, it also enters into like a different kind of economy of objects. So, I mean, games cost $60 if they're on this level, like AAA games, or they used to. Increasingly, they're costing $70 or whatever. But like artworks can be, I don't know, millions of dollars, featuring a banana taped to a wall. Like the like market economy for an artwork is just on a completely different level.
Right.
And so
right.
I feel like there might be, they're like branding a game as an artwork that one might, I don't know, can someone collect Black Myth Wukong? Like, is there
Right.
like some kind of like, and I think that's part of the like the core tension between a popular form that circulates on our devices or our consoles, like video games, versus the like a rarefied commodity in the art world, which is its value is built on its scarcity, that there's just one of them, or there's just like a limited number of them, and so I think it's the play of like economic scarcity that might be most interesting to think about in that.
Yeah. I mean, it does speak to this unique place that games sort of like sit in. They can be both things simultaneously, and they can be things that are that check two different boxes. And I think it's kind of like a special. It's kind of like a special place. I mean, it does speak to also maybe sort of the strange place that games sit in, because those are characteristics that you would sort of think of as like design objects. I think sometimes sit in that in-between category where, a memes chair or something like that can both be something that belongs at a museum, but also something that can be owned by like millions and millions of people. And so, so I think that is some of it too, that games are this like interesting intersection, because the visual medium, it's usually a visual medium. It can sort of be considered in a visual art context because it's an interactive medium. It could be considered in a digital commerce context, like other things that you can buy on your phone. But then also because it is a design object, it has the potential to, have a scale, so to speak, of it's able to have a scale of reach and impact that is sort of unique as well. So it is like a really, I think, interesting question for like where games kind of can sit and be multimodal in that way. They sort of could be in a bunch of different places simultaneously. Yeah. And that is what draws me to them, but it is also very strange.
I was thinking, like, alongside the economics, there's also like the temporality of like, you can't sit in the Venice, in the Chinese pavilion and play 60 hours of Black Myth Wukong to get to the end of it. And so like, artists that do have these hybrid practices like have to design with like, the temporality of a gallery in mind. Whether that's like, if you have like a long form media, like, I don't know, like Christian Marclay's clocks or something that can run, for 24 hours and you only see the moments that you see, or you have to like shorten these really long things into like short clips that somebody who's like idly strolling through a gallery is going to see like the 3 minutes on a loop that you might want them to see. And I think with interactive media, that becomes that much more difficult. Like, can you have a meaningful experience interacting with an object over like the 3 minutes that you might give it? I mean, 3 minutes wouldn't be enough to get through like just figuring out the basic functions of playing Black Myth Wukong.
Right.
So
right.
There's something about like the like inherent kind of like time demands, I think, that the different spaces produce.
Yeah. All right. Well, moving on. One of the other things that I looked at this week was just an absolute banger of an essay by Damjan Jovanovic. I believe teaches at SciArc, is a game designer themselves. Damjan wrote an essay called Collision Mesh of the Real, but it's really about Backrooms. It's really about Backrooms, the concept and the movie. I thought this was just like a fascinating piece to read. The argument that he follows is basically that the the usual filing, the way we think about what makes something like this image of the Backrooms, which was this image of an empty office building, office room somewhere that showed up on 4chan and kind of like developed its own mythology online, is that we think about the empty offices, the damp carpet, the fluorescent hum. And what John Wick argues is that the way we talk about Backrooms is that's only like the atmosphere, like that is the way that it's sort of like this mood and the setting. But he presupposes that Backrooms as a concept, this idea that there are these places that no person should go, is premised on this idea of something that's familiar for people who play games, this idea of like the no clip, like when you are playing a game and you pass through a wall or something like that. The wall is never really a wall. It's just like it's this liminal space that you can kind of pass through, and that there's sort of this implied engagement with games when we think about Backrooms like as a concept. I loved this essay. He draws this lineage from Solaris to Annihilation, the book Annihilation. Kind of jumps in and out. Obviously, he's an architect, or he's interested in architecture, and so kind of jumps between a lot of different places. But the big idea here is that the Backrooms are this like internet native folk cosmology, and it's built across all these different wikis and videos because the world allows for itself to behave like a game environment. Yeah, could you tell me a little bit about your experience with the Backrooms? I remember seeing it kind of like being passed around like over the years. So, on one hand, I was like a little surprised that it had become a film at some level, because it is just, there was a short video, but on its face, it does seem like it does not seem too unlike like the Battleship movie, or like, on its face, it's like, oh, this is just another example of Hollywood looking for like anything that might resemble IP and then trying to turn it into something. But clearly I did not see the potential. But can you tell me a little bit about your experience maybe with this Backrooms concept, and then we can talk a little bit more about the essay as well.
Yeah, I've been thinking so much about the Backrooms because I'm working on the eerie, and it is like, I think it's like the defining kind of eerie space in the present. And part of my interest in the eerie is, I feel like things like one of the reasons why I think the Backrooms is so persistent and so inspiring. I mean, my students are all obsessed with the Backrooms. One of them made a project where they recreated our classroom as a final project. But of course, you could no clip through the wall of our classroom and find yourself in the Backrooms. So like there's something like, oh, okay, so it's related to like institutions. It's related to these like digital networks. And I think, in particular, this kind of like empty, haunted space, part of what one of the reasons why I'm turning to games to think about ordinary media, like increasingly the internet feels like the Backrooms, that there's something about this kind of like, it feels like there might be people there, but it's also like hollowed out and empty. And, increasingly, like, what is it? Like some 60% of internet traffic is run by bots.
Right.
Like, like it feels like we're living in this kind of space that used to be inhabited, that used to have a purpose. I know you've been thinking a lot about offices and Severance, which is a kind of Backrooms adjacent property.
Yeah, right. Yes,
like,
yeah.
Like these spaces used to have like meaning, and like it feels like the meaning has evaporated, but what we have left over are these like empty, haunted infrastructures where real experiences used to happen. And so I think it like taps into like a profound kind of affect for our current moment.
Yeah.
The essay in particular, which go ahead.
Yeah, one of the things that I liked about the way that he had structured this is that we sort of think about like empty spaces like that as he talks about this difference between like spaces that have not been inhabited versus formerly inhabited, and they have a different kind of like register. And so we often think of like this like spooky image or something like that is a place that no one's ever gone to. It's the haunted house. It's as opposed to a space that sort of implies that someone was just there and the door just closed behind you. Now you've walked into the space, and it leaves you with these questions about like what just came before, because it's not, these images are not, they're not run down, they're not, these are not like dilapidated. There is a crispness to them that implies that there is something that just on the other edge. So I love that distinction in the essay. I thought that was a super interesting way to kind of think about it.
Yeah, and that's how Mark Fisher talks about the eerie, is like, you expect something to be there and it's not there, and there's something that like an empty mall or the Backrooms. But what I loved about this, and you cited, I think, the most interesting part from the essay about the exhaustion of grandeur.
Yeah.
An infinity that has no majesty, which I love, but also that it's like a maintenance space. Like these Backrooms, like the lights still work, and they're often they're quite clean. It's like, did somebody vacuum the carpet in the back room?
Right, 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 right.
Who's
Yeah,
fixing the lights? And so there's something about like the ordinariness, like that. There's something like banal and like familiar, but also it's like, yeah, it's got this kind of like, you wonder to its like lack of grandeur. So like the backrooms are also just like simultaneous to each other, that you can be, I don't know, chased by Shrek through the back rooms, and which is one popular mod, and like every hallway looks more or less the same. So you get this kind of like
right.
disoriented, but also like kind of like hollowed out, again, like banal, but like, yeah, the loss of grandeur and the loss of majesty, I find really important to thinking about the backrooms. I'd love to hear, yeah, your thoughts on like that aspect, and yeah, how that clip showed up in the newsletter this week.
Yeah, I guess this is the little section. This is what makes the back room such an important image. They are one of the clearest forms contemporary culture has produced of infinity after the exhaustion of grandeur. They still imagine an infinite world, but this infinity has no majesty. It's given up every claim to the celestial, the divine, the abysmal, the oceanic, and the properly ruinous, and is lit instead by fluorescent tubes and covered in carpet. The absolute has become maintained space. What it got me thinking about a lot is, I think we live in a very like interesting and sort of precarious moment, particularly living here in the United States, where I do think that I had somebody tell me that described like Amsterdam this way. And when you come to these cities, these places that were former sites of like global power, they're places that have abandoned any sort of like pretense of grandeur. So his fellow was Dutch, and he's like, I feel Amsterdam is that way. You can sort of like feel it in the air. Like the buildings are slightly at a list. Like this is a place that like used to be the center of the universe and is no longer. I feel that way. You go to Buenos Aires, I feel like the same way as like the center of Latin American economic power, has these these beautiful, it's like beautiful buildings that are sort of like slightly in disrepair. And in some ways, living here in the United States, it does get me thinking about like maybe that is the backrooms is a resonant image because it is like a projection into the future, is a way of thinking about like these things that might be someday, these like moments of American, quote unquote, like American greatness or grandeur or whatever, that might be like slowly falling into disrepair. I think that is what got me interested. I mean, the other part of it was that really struck me was his idea of like the game engine uncanny. I think a lot about the ways, I have this hypothesis about like games that like we sort of think of games as being this discrete thing, but if we think of them as an arch form, then maybe we'll find them in all of these, like 100 years from now, we may have all of these things that bear the resemblance of fingerprints of a ludic century, but we won't be able to necessarily distinguish them that way. And so that was what I think what jumped out at me, is that like Backrooms from a film context as an image, as a form of like folk media, but also the fact that it's now become a very popular film, sort of like Edge of Tomorrow, the Doug Liman film, where sort of Tom Cruise is playing this character, that it kind of takes a very, I think, in some ways, a very effective. I really like that movie, but a very sort of crude way of thinking about games. Like you die, and then you get to what if you could repeat your life over and over again in an action movie context? This is like a much more sophisticated engagement, I think, with games. Games with games speaks to what I think is the extremely high degree of literacy that exists in internet communities with games as a conversive form of language. And that's what propels backwards. You don't have to say this is a video game movie, which is what, the essay is about. But that is implied for people who watch it. They are familiar with these ideas because they've spent the majority of their lives like playing games. That was what really jumped. I think that was the piece that really jumped out at me, and why it fit in that intersection category for me.
Yeah, I love this, like, yeah, reverse engineering of ludic reading. Like, I was thinking about the manga All You Need Is Kill, I think, which is the Edge of Tomorrow. But with Backrooms, I think a lot. I've been trying to think alongside Nihei's Blam, which is this like kind of like big haunted, empty kind of like Dyson sphere, where there used to be culture, but it's all gone, and you just get these like big haunted, empty corridors all across the work. And I think thinking about that through games actually changes the way that you might experience that. I also think that the Backrooms like remind me quite a bit of what happens with large language models right now, where, like there's nothing that feels more like the Backrooms than getting an email that is like clearly written by AI, or worse, like an essay or a thesis written by AI. Like, like large language models are made up of all of the productions of real humans, mostly. Our culture, our books, like there used to be humans there, but they're regurgitated in this kind of like hollowed out, undead, zombified form. And I think it's that, like, and the internet also, like, just replete with its ads and everything, increasingly feels like a kind of like undead, empty space that's like, there used to be people here, but now there's just like these like weird robots that are chasing you and
Yeah.
watching you, like surveilling you
Yeah.
everywhere you go. Like that's part of the uncanny too, is you walk through the back rooms and you have the sense like somebody is watching me. And I think we can't escape this kind of sense that we're always being surveilled. Like every time we click on a link or move through the world,
Yeah.
that it picks up on. Yeah.
Well, that's actually, I think, a good seg. I think it's actually a really good seg to a last little piece. I did a feature this week on a game designer named Cat Milk. I didn't ask Cat Milk why. I didn't ask them about why they're called Cat Milk. The person is unnamed, but I did conduct an interview with them. Presumably, this is not an AI figure on the internet. Like Cat Milk. It's part of a series I've been doing called Currently Making. Very interesting games in development. It's such an interesting public process. I think something I think is really unique about games is that so much of the production does happen. So much of the production, increasingly more of the production, happens in plain sight in a way that is like legible and visible for people over a longer period of time. That really does not happen. Like when someone's writing a book, sometimes they'll write like, they'll release an excerpt or write an essay. But, game makers are often releasing prototypes, they're releasing demos, they're releasing images, they're releasing short little videos. So I'd come across his work, I think, on Instagram and then reached out for an interview. Let me just play the trailer here.
Yeah, please.
Just a couple days, I guess. I didn't realize that. I forgot. Steam Access is coming right up. So the essay, the feature I wrote on Cat Milk was called What Does Violence Look Like in Pink? And Cat Milk has been working on this game for the last 4 years. It's a first-person shooter that takes The Office really seriously as a site of hyperviolence through a sci-fi lens. Climate flooding has shrunk the land. Cities have stacked everyone into single corporate towers. They're defended by these private militaries, and you play as a corporate peacekeeper. A deal goes wrong, you fight your way out. They're still working through the kind of the plot. But I thought of this as being in this office as pressure chamber, like kind of like Lineage. My wife and I have been watching Jacques Tati's Playtime, which at the time was like the most expensive French film ever made. Its titular character kind of like wandering through this man in the gray suit, kind of like dreamscape. Office Space is a good example. Severance. Criterion recently did a great like corporate thrillers collection with The Deal and with The Deal and The Firm and The Deal, The Firm, and then there were a couple others. There's Disclosure. Just a lot of great films that Michael Clayton obviously is a great example. And there's this irony that game companies. I think there's also this irony that like game companies themselves are also made in these like extremely boring like office parks. If you live here in Los Angeles, you'll see like the Square Enix office, which is right by the LAX, is like just the most. I mean, given how unusual Square Enix's games typically are, is the exterior really belies sort of like the madness within. That anyway. So all these things were kind of like buzzing in my head before I sat down and interviewed Cat Milk. Let me just play a quick clip here from the interview, and then we can kind of talk about it. This is Cat Milk talking about corporate militarism as a concept for the interview.
Like in the game, like or lore wise or whatever, but kind of like the base that I'm building the game off of is this that I feel like, I don't know, this idea of like corporate militarism, I don't know what you'd call it, has always like been interesting to me, where like these companies in the future like hire militaries and stuff and to maintain their shareholder value or whatever. It's just like bringing it into this like violent forefront. I just think that's an interesting like sci-fi idea.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to play around with that a bit. And so that's kind of like the main thing is like this, basically like the flooding has reduced land size from like climate change or whatever. And so all these cities are like condensed into these really tall buildings that are each owned by different companies, and then each building is like protected by these militaries, and like thinking about how the conflicts that will arise between them. And I guess like the inciting reason for the player to be there is that they are in this corporate military as like some peacekeeper, and then like some business deal goes wrong and the building is taken over or something, and so you have to basically fight your way through the building to like save your company.
Um, Can you tell me a little bit? What do you think about like this? This is a setting for a game. It's kind of a mix of both like near future, distant future, not so distant future with climate stuff. Recent past with late stage capitalism. I don't know. Tell me a little bit what speaks to you, maybe thematically, about the space that Cat Milk has decided to inhabit, like for a game like this.
Yeah, yeah, I think there's so much there. And to your inventory of office movies, I'd add, these contemporary like Secession or
Right. Yeah.
Mountainhead, right, where they're not in the office, but they're like determining the fate of the world from a company retreat, more or less. But I think there's models for this in games too. I think about it in relationship to say the corporations in Cyberpunk 2077, or the like the remaining corporations, the foundational corporations, and the Outer Worlds, which I think does this kind of skewering well. I love that the role of Candy in this one is kind of amazing, and I want to talk a lot about trash and waste, I suppose. But I think that there's something about that imaginary of this like militarized corporate future that again I think, and this is Jameson and others, that like speculative fiction always tells us more about our present moment, and we see the dominance and the power that these like big tech companies or these like core conglomerate like mega companies already have, and the violence that they produce is maybe less on the surface. And so I feel like a game like this can like tap into like these like the otherwise invisible structures of violence and harm that these corporations are producing, and this one's just like right on the nose. Like you're like
Right.
I think you're a security guard that's like going through this like hellscape of an office, and very I think the Backrooms is a good transition. But I like also that like there's something a little bit more closer to our present, less bizarre maybe than its closest analog, which is obviously Cruelty Squad,
Right.
where
Sure.
Cruelty Squad is this kind of, and maybe we can parse their aesthetics a bit more as we talk. But I do feel like this whole trend of like the militarized corporate future is like that feels like a real extrapolation from where we're at. But B, like maybe can help us reflect on what companies try to do, which is to make their violence invisible.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think it's an interesting turn for games. Also, sort of think of like first person shooters as a genre, either focus on these like fantastic environments. So, Halo, or, so like these sci-fi and violence, sci-fi, or, occasionally there's like kind of like some steampunk. You're sort of bound by like having a projectile, right? And so that maybe sort of like limits some of the places. And so I think the idea of like bringing that stuff like more in-house, so to speak. Yeah, I think it does. I do think it speaks to like a specific moment that we are living in, when, data centers and, both data centers and ICE are looking at like office parks, looking at office parks as places to like be their home location. It does seem like very fitting, but also just very like extremely, extremely, extremely sad.
Yeah, and I loved in, I think it was in the Funland zine. Well, one, like, Cat Milk talks about their father being a security guard, and so there's this kind of like intimacy to the kind of security work that one does for like a haunted corporate park. Like usually you're working late at night where everyone's gone, so that's like a kind of back rooms. But also I think Cat Milk in the interview with you mentioned that they're currently working in IT. And like, there's no one who knows the backrooms better than somebody working in IT who has to go to like some random room to fix like some broken device or some connection that's not working.
Yeah.
And that like you have to like actually like visualize the technical infrastructure of a space to work in IT. So part of my when I was reading through and listening to your great conversation with Cat Milk, a lot of it was like, all right, like I can place this this makes sense, and like it feels like a lot of the approach here comes out of a lived experience.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You mentioned the aesthetic piece earlier. One of the things that jumped out, I mean, I think some of this is maybe some of the conventions, the ways that games are, sort of distributed and marketed. There was a texture. I spoke to him a little bit about this, that like this kind of like a like lithographic kind of style. I thought was was really interesting to me. It's kind of like the stipulization. Stipulization, this stipple effect, but then also the color palette as well. You mentioned Cruelty Squad. I think that is definitely a clear jumping off point. But I do think that the use of pink in the work itself did stand out to me. Is what I thought was like did definitely stand out to me. It's a color that exists, and yet there is a legacy of pink games that is highly gender constrained, and I did really like that Cat Milk had made this like very conscious decision, like this is going to be a game that like very heavily features the color, and not like it's not like in a it's not being used in a it's not it's like in a sarcastic way, but more just like oh, this is a color that really could like mark the experience. I didn't get that sense from talking to Cat Milk that was that they were trying to say something. It did seem like it was purely like this is there is something unique here about this color, and seeing it in this game context is kind of a kind of unusual.
Well, they did say they'd start, and I think one of the most interesting features is the eyes at the top.
Yeah,
this kind of like
yeah.
rear view mirror of yourself as you're moving, which is also like an old game mechanic. But they mentioned that they started there, and I was thinking a lot, I guess, about pinkness in relationship to whiteness. Like, like instead of like a white default character, like the character's skin is pink, and
right.
The Cat Milk built the game around the color of the skin of the main character, and so I think that there's something about like I don't know, like denaturalizing or like removing like the default whiteness to have like that like the pinkness of the character makes its like white racialization to me far more like present and like and I think that I don't know, so I was kind of but also I was like thinking of the pinkness of the walls in that Wuthering Heights movie.
Okay.
You saw this like wallpaper based on this like very pink skin, and so like there's this kind of like, so the idea of like rooms being actually like almost made out of flesh, or there's something kind of Cronenbergian there or something, but like you can see in this one, the one image that like the color of the face and the color of the floor are like the exact same color, and so like are you like you see your own eyes, but you're also like maybe walking on some kind of skin, and that feels like really weird, uncanny to me, which I like.
Yeah. Well, the last thing I wanted to talk about with Cat Milk was the dreaded F word. I'll play the clip from this conversation.
Assume like fun and like something gripping and all the rest. Idea is very, I think, confusing to me, especially because like, yeah, I don't have other opinions on this project right now. Like, there's what people see in videos and things. I'm hoping to get an idea of like how people enjoy it. And to me about this project is like not really, it's sort of like intentionally leaning away from that idea of optimizing for fun.
Yeah.
A lot of my favorite games have been either purposefully or negligently like unfun. It's more important to me to follow like the world and having it be immersive and having this be like a digital object.
The F word, I've had this conversation with many people over the years, whether or not games need to be fun. My feeling is that there's a boundary of language here. We simply do not have a word, at least in English, that describes what it is. And the legacy of fun, because it's so deeply tied to like amusement, it sort of belies difficulty at some level, some degree of challenge, some degree of friction. And that is, my feeling is it's an onerous burden for games. That games are required to be fun in some way. I think for people who play games, I think they understand that there's like texture to that. They understand that fun games can be very much like unfun. But it was interesting to hear him kind of like vocalize that as a game designer. And there's quite a few unfun games. And so, yeah, I was curious about like your experiences with that word, how you think it reflects on maybe the work that he's trying to do. But yeah, that is for me like a real constraint, I think, for games as an art form, is this idea that they need to be fun, because that's the default language for like how we describe what it is that happens there.
Yeah, I think that's, it's a good question for like the maturity of the medium as well. Like, we don't expect novels to be fun.
Right.
Or like, like great works of literature aren't supposed to be fun, right? They're supposed to do other things, or maybe like, show us something about ourselves and our place in the world, or expand our horizons. And so like, obviously like that I think is a kind of starting point, that like games never needed to be fun. I also think that the definition of a game, which for so long has been rooted in this kind of Wizinga sense of like consensual play, has been usefully complicated by folks like Aaron Trammell, who argues, play, like games haven't always been fun, and they haven't always been consensual. And like,
Right.
like you can play games, say, with other humans, or he opens up to questions of, say, torture or sex play. Like there are things like sex play isn't fun. Like it's doing a different kind of thing. And so I think like, yeah, I think we're moving that onus from games being fun. And so much of that's about like the discourse of like, I don't know, Steam reviews or like IGN,
Right.
places that are like, this game is not fun. Like, don't spend your $10 on it or whatever. But I think like this game is also like, when it looks fun to me, and it's also funny. Like it's very funny. Like that floppy hand that you use to like reload your gun, and also you have to like feed yourself. It's got this kind of like wobble physics that I find like just always kind of like mildly hilarious. But it also has this like very funny relationship to trash, where it's like every time you eat a candy or expend a shell, it like builds up this kind of like trash register at which is just so funny. And like, so you can imagine this very funny gameplay, like, once the demo's out, to like there's something, sense of like comedy is like running against a wall, right? And so like you like can't quite do something. And so like there's something like fun or funny about like attempting to reload a gun because you've got some enemies coming at you, and like you can't because your trash is in the way. Like that.
Right.
So,
right.
Like
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, this idea of fun did come up this week. We didn't cover it I didn't have it planned for today, but I pulled something from the archive, an essay about this game called Chiller, which is a game that was done in the 80s. It was not very popular because it's basically like a torture simulator. I mean, basically like it's like a horror. I sort of thought of it as like it's this B-movie horror game, but without any of the kind of the attendant maybe like silliness or camp that you sort of associate. It's just like a game where you can shoot people's limbs off, and of course it was not very popular because nobody bought it. And this essay was written by Mitch Kripata, gosh, almost like 15 years ago. But yeah, that was one that I think in a weird way, kind of like ahead of its time, in a sense that it's like challenging some sort. And this is work that was not meant to be like it was not meant to be like experimental or provocative, like in that way. It was not an art statement to sort of like make commentary on violence during the Reagan years or something like that. It was just some ostensibly like dudes making a super violent game. And but it does kind of play with this idea because there's such a discomfort. Like I'm not even going to show it because it's extreme. I found it to be like gross even in like an 8-bit form.
Yeah.
It's like very uncomfortable to like a trauma style like level like violence. But it does kind of like play at that idea that like, games that can be a certain way, if there wasn't like a direct lineage that stemmed out of it in that way. So there has been a lineage. There have been like sort of people pushing at the edges, but maybe not like not in an intentional way. I don't think of that as being particularly intentional. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. One last piece. We got one more trailer. I had a conversation this past weekend with a game urbanist and game designer from Chile named Jose Sanchez. We've profiled him. I'll link to it in the show notes. He's done a couple different games around like collective architecture, one called Blockhood. Anyway, we got to talking, he's from Chile. We got to talking about the balance. I was asking about localization. Like, how do you make those change? How do you make a decision as a game designer making a game for a global context, or a game that can be experienced, kind of to our point earlier, like games do have this ability to spread across borders in a really profound way. How do you find that balance between having something that focuses on like hyper local routines and customs? What concessions do you make when you try to expand the boundaries for like what's possible? And so I came across this game called Rocky. You play as here. Let me just play I'll just play the trailer for you. Okay, so I just have to say, like, out the gate, I'm not a big cozy, wholesome games. We can revisit this. I think there's like an important political dimension for those games that we can talk about like at another time that I respect and totally understand, particularly as it relates to people who do caregiving and wanting to find comfort in games in a different context. That is not the type of player that I am. I more respond to like the visual language. That's a totally separate thing. For this game in particular, I was super interested in like how hyper specific the location is, like Goa, India, 1992. That is that you're playing as an auto-rickshaw driver who picks up characters along the way. That dynamic, I think, is like a really universal one, like using the vehicle as a vehicle, so to speak, for narrative, for storytelling. It gives you this ability to pick up different characters in different ways. Each character has a different story. Obviously, in games, there's a lineage there. Games like NeoCab, for example. But even outside of games, I feel like that is a very like universal way to tell a story. At the same time, this is a very specific place, in some way, a very specific team that did not make an attempt to say like, oh, this is a game that could be in a fantasy environment. This is like a very specific hyper local kind of like theme. I was curious for you, Danny, how you've kind of like seen hyper local themes like work in your work. Is that I mean, I guess maybe to put it provocatively, like, is that an opportunity, or do you risk kind of like losing the this is not my position, but like, is there something that you give up by making something like hyper local if you're not from that specific time and place? I have thought, but I was trying to think of a way to frame it in a maybe more provocative way.
I think this is such a lovely way to kind of, get to the end of our conversation, is like we've been looking at all these like speculative spaces, like, Backrooms are kind of like every corporate park, but they're also like literally a no place that you have to no clip into. And so like the flip side of that is these like hyper specific and contextual spaces, which I think there's a real hunger for. I mean, Mixtape's success, for example, it's like specific moment in time, specific place in the Pacific Northwest, that I think is part of what makes that work, is like that like specificity of location, which like I think adds to like a different kind of fantasy. Like it reads more like historical fiction or something, right? That produces like a real kind of simulacrum or some kind of thing that you can like go back into, and usually that taps into nostalgia in some ways, but also like it feels like traveling. I think that's why I love games that have really accurate reconstruction of cities. Like playing I don't know, Yakuza Infinite Wealth. I've never gone to Hawaii, but I spent a lot of time in Yakuza's Hawaii, which is a pretty accurate model of that area. And so I think that there's something really I don't know, meaningful about being able to move through that world in that way, and that like power of games, that you are exploring spaces that are often fantastical, but you build a kind of mind map of whatever space you're navigating, and to like know that like, oh, this is a very specific place from a specific point in time, I think is really powerful, especially for underrepresented areas. I'm thinking about Chia, which is like a fantastical version of New Catalonia, which did this really beautifully as well. That game designers are able to maybe open their doors and share cultural experiences that would be hard to access otherwise. This is something film's done for a long time. Like, we don't
I know, right?
Like film, like that's how you know the world is like, oh, there's like, world cinema is how you can know these places or know stories that you wouldn't otherwise encounter. And I love to see games that are able to do that kind of work.
Yeah. I mean, my more like cynical take, I guess, is that we've simply exhausted the number of unique stories that can be told with like European mythology.
Well, that's true too.
Like we just have run out, and space has no place in time and culture. So like, I think, and because fantasy has been so narrowly focused on like basically on European fantasy. I mean, we talked about Black Myths Wukong earlier, which is set in like a Chinese mythological world. Like there's both a commercial reality, which is like zig when other people are zagging. But then there's also this creative reality, which is simply like you just run out of things that you can say. I mean, I was camping a couple weeks ago, and we stopped by this there's this Western film museum outside of in the Eastern Sierras that you can go to. It is it is a very specific idea like of the West, and it's focused on Lone Pine, where there's a lot of activity. But you think about the Western like as a genre, kind of like lived and died. It's a very specific idea of the Western. And then you kind of like basically run out of the number of stories that you can tell. I think that something that audiences get fatigued. And so I do think it's like maybe you just sort of need this one thing to come first, which is this first like 40 years of video games. And now this next thing is coming, which is like people who grew up with those types of things, they become conversant in the language, and then there's a hunger and a desire to just like express the place where you live. I mean, the funny thing is that like this model for games has been like hiding in plain sight with Grand Theft Auto, which is one of the most popular franchises on the planet. I mean, I get it, it's not based in a real place, but it's very much based on a real place. And it is so funny to me that that has not like necessarily inspired like a wealth of people making like even hyper local games like in the United States, like New Orleans or Chicago or like your little hometown neighborhood. So I just I'm very interested, and you do see it sometimes, you know, in terms of like Alan Wake and the Pacific Northwest and things like that.
Yeah,
But,
I mean, you know, academics love to talk about Assassin's Creed, so I won't
right,
do that.
Yeah.
But also, you know, games that I know, a game that we both love, Despelote, which, you know,
Absolutely.
occurs like in a really specific moment in time, includes like actual footage from soccer matches, and has like a kind of like realism to it that like it clearly comes through as a lived experience. So I think like as games are trying to be meaningful and give us meaningful experiences, that old adage, what is it? Write what you know, right? Like maybe it's like game what you know, and that adds so much like texture and nuance to the kind of characters you build, the kind of world that you build, and you know, the specific time in which those like characters and spaces can come together.
Yeah, and also the constraints of being an independent game maker just means that you have to narrow the scope. And I think that can be like tremendously powerful. Thinking of, you know, Jean Dielman, you know, the film Jean Dielman, it's 3.5 hours, mostly takes place inside of this woman's apartment. And then occasionally like in the streets of, I think it's, I believe it's set in Belgium, I believe, but you know, you can do something really profound with something that's very, very small. And I think games have often, the desire for kind of that thing we were saying earlier about this like exhaustion of grandeur. Maybe there's a little bit of that at play as well, where it's like, I don't need any big space epics. I don't need these giant worlds. What I want is something that's like actually like is pretty small and pretty narrow. It's pretty small and pretty narrow, and there are opportunities there. And if it's short, that's my other big thing. I love short games. So
game,
under 5 hours, that's like, you know, the key to my heart. Okay, great. Well, Danny, thank you so much for making time. Where can people find your work, I guess? Where do you, what should we point people to see what Danny's up to? Because you also have books to promote as well. So I applaud your restraint for not plugging.
This is just such a delight. Thank you so much for having me, Jamin. I'd love to have this kind of conversation. I'm pretty easy to Google. My website's dss-edit.com. I have a book that's out called The Little Database, A Poetics of Media Formats, that's about digital archiving and also these like questions of like an older internet that's maybe rapidly disappearing. The thing I want to plug though is I'm just finished teaching a class. It's got a great title. That time I got reincarnated as a UCLA creative writing seminar isekai experiment. I spent 10 weeks with my students thinking about the long lineage of portal fantasies that isekai represents, from Alice in Wonderland all the way up to experimental games like Baby Steps, which is an isekai. And the students and I, we started the class like taking the premise seriously, where we all got killed at the same time. We all got isekai'd, and then 16 of us had to inhabit a shared body. We decided that shared body was a video game system that would give out quests. And so then we, like, over the course of the quarter, we made like dating sims and bitsy games and you know, a whole range of things that built out this like shared mythos of what happened to these students, only at the end to discover that we died by PowerPoint. You know, death by PowerPoint is one way, and then return to ourselves at the end of the quarter. But that course, like everything I teach, the syllabi is available online for free and has a lot of resources in that field. So I like to be able to share those whenever I can in these kinds of circumstances, and we'll post the link alongside the conversation.
Sounds good. And if you listen to us for the last like hour and 15 minutes and you made it all the way through, so that, you know, you can subscribe to the Kill Screen newsletter. It comes out on Tuesdays and Fridays usually, although I'll be going on vacation. So it's a pre-vacation warning. So there will be a brief hiatus. But this was wonderful, Danny. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you making time.
Thank you. Thank you so much.